This is part 2 of our 4-part series on European rearmament. If you want to hear Neil, Melvin and Rusi unpack the complicated world of European defence procurement, simply click the link in the description for part 1. But if you don't mind picking up partway through the story, then here is part 2.
Part 2. A customized calamity.
I think you have to connect spending with capabilities. And I like to use the comparison between the United Kingdom, the UK military, and the Italian military, for me, is one of the really useful ways of thinking about this. So on paper, the UK military has a substantially larger budget than the Italian military. And on paper, the British Army, Navy, and Air Force have substantial capabilities. The UK has a nuclear deterrent. But in practice, a lot of that spending is not as effective as on paper it claims to be. And so, you can argue about there have been sort of huge blunders made in terms of UK defense spending on projects like Ajax, which is a infantry fighting vehicle, which the Spanish just bought off the shelf, and the British just demanded 1,000 different alterations to it, which means it doesn't work, whereas the Spanish model does. Or you could look at the gradual erosion and collapse of British military bases because they haven't invested in them properly, the gradual shrinkage of basically the shrinkage of the British Army to 79,000 men, so that the Britain hasn't had this few soldiers since in the army and land forces since the mid-18th century, probably since the 1740s.
Alex Clarkson is a senior lecturer in German, European and International Studies at King's College in London, with his primary research focusing on the European Union's military spending patterns, cross-border relations and defensive doctrines. He's also authored a number of great works on the subject, including The Political Economy of Border Regimes and the EU's Stealthy Hegemony and Ambiguous Neighbours. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
So what you were looking at here is, on the other hand, an Italian military, which has a lot of weaknesses, but where the investment is focused on 2 or 3 different priorities. And those priorities all rotate around the Mediterranean. So the Italians have a highly effective navy. They're probably one of the few European countries that have expanded their navy. They have substantial weaknesses in their land forces, but all those parts of the army that they need to control the Mediterranean are highly effective. They have an air force that's designed for those tasks, which is to the frustration, for example, of the Americans or the East Europeans, because they would like the Italians to make more of a contribution to the East, which the Italians struggle to. So the point is to think not just in terms of spending, but what the money is spent on and how effectively it's spent. And there you have substantial differences between different European militaries. I mean, the Italian military, to take that example again, is substantially stronger than the German military, even though the German military spends a lot more, because the Italians have a clear strategic doctrine in terms of where their strategic center of gravity is. The Italians, if you read their defense papers, are entirely focused on the Mediterranean. They're not that interested in the world beyond the Mediterranean in military terms. So they get, in that sense, more bang for their buck. A good example of that, as well as in Eastern Europe, is Poland. And the Polish, they have a different orientation. They're a land power. They have a clear sense of a threat from Russia in the east. And they focus the great bulk of their investment on artillery, on tanks, multi-launch rocket systems, and the infantry forces around that to protect, shield that, and take advantage of that. The Poles, again, are building and very rapidly building a highly effective military, not because their budget is huge, but because they use their budget well. And so I think when we look at the different levels of spending in the EU or among the EU states or European NATO states, if you include Britain, it's not just about the headline budget figure.
You raise an interesting concept with the armies designed for their own nation's needs. And we see this with the British Army being mostly designed as a tip-of-the-spear expeditionary force, the French Army being designed to fight in the Sahel and defend its own territories. We see with the Italians designing their army around defending the Mediterranean. But what about the Germans? What is the Bundeswehr designed to do?
There's the German military doctrine in theory, and there's German military policy in practice. So the German military has, since the Cold War, been relatively disorientated in terms of strategy, but also reflecting wider blunders or a lack of kind of a military focus in German military strategy. We have to think about this historically, and sometimes we sort of throw accusations at politicians of the past without thinking through the particular historical context they were operating in. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, there was a general belief, at least within the German political and military elite, that Russia had ceased to be a threat to Europe. But the main raison d'etre of the German military has been as a land power, at least since 1945 in terms of the West German military, to help NATO ward off a Soviet or Russian threat. So when the Cold War comes to an end and the German political elite genuinely believes that, to put it this way, this time is different and history really is over, the German military became a target of cuts. On the other hand, because of the wars in the Balkans, the wars in Yugoslavia, there still was a pressure to maintain a substantial enough military force to act in a kind of a policeman, or I prefer to call it a gendarmerie role. There's a particular form of national policing that has a military dimension. It's very much in a kind of European tradition. And so what you had is, on paper, the German Bundeswehr, the German military, was still claimed to act as a key hinge and leadership actor in the European military sphere, whereas in practice, it became a target of cuts. It became, particularly during the Eurozone crisis, so particularly during the period between 2009 and 2015, when the entire EU system and the Eurozone system, the currency crisis, forced all European countries to cut. Although, interestingly, the Italians never really cut their navy. It was interesting where they put their priorities. The Bundeswehr became a target for cuts. There was an attempted reform in 2010, and as with any kind of reform process that tries to reform things on the cheap, it made things much worse. There was lack of maintenance. There was lack of strategic focus. And in the end, what you had was not really a strategy. You had reactive policies. So, for example, when there was the war in Afghanistan, when Germany decided to oppose the invasion of Iraq, the German government, to keep the Bush administration, Bush administration, happy, promised to commit German troops to operations in Afghanistan, but they were under-resourced, not properly trained, but that stretched the German military that was already suffering from cuts. Similarly, in the last 10 years, the German government repeatedly made commitments to the French to send their troops to be involved in the Sahel and in operations like Barkhane. But again, there was no reorientation of strategic doctrine, no shifting of spending, no buying of new equipment for that specific task. It was simply a reactive measure to keep the French happy in those kinds of circumstances.
Many analysts will point to the fact that Europe managed to blunt the Russian offensive in Ukraine by throwing all of the Warsaw Pact gear and munitions they had sitting around in storage bunkers at the Ukrainians in those first few weeks, giving them enough anti-tank weapons and artillery to prevent the Russians from taking some of these major cities in Ukraine. But by now, the Europeans have burnt through most of the Warsaw Pact gear that was sitting in the bunkers. So, if in the future the Russians were to launch an invasion of Georgia or Moldova, or there was another outbreak of conflict within the Balkans, is there a supply of Warsaw Pact gear left that the Europeans could quickly flood the defenders like they did for Ukraine? Should Europe reproduce its Warsaw Pact supplies, or is that type of equipment now just a relic of the past?
I think that's the biggest long-term weakness. And I think that's something that is happening. It's changing very rapidly. And again, the centers of power for that within the EU in particular are in places that aren't necessarily on the main focus of analysts. A lot of wider media debate, focuses on the European military industries, arms industries, or the big militaries. They tend to, of course, focus on France, UK, Germany, maybe Italy. But if we're looking at the kind of military industrial facilities that for basic shell production, for example, most of those are centered in Romania, not just for Warsaw Pact kind of arms, but what they're doing very rapidly is converting their factories to produce NATO standard armaments and munitions. There was a very slow program there. It's now rapidly accelerating. Another big center of arms production is Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland. So actually what's happening is in terms of military power and in terms of people who help call the shots at the big European table, suddenly, whereas during the Eurozone crisis, the crisis of Europe's currency, or the migration crisis, the Central and Eastern Europeans were a little bit peripheral to EU policymaking. Suddenly, both within EU or the whole collection of European states within NATO, suddenly the Central and Eastern European states are central actors. They're helping to secure both NATO as well as the basic foundations of the EU's wider system. So I think in terms of arms production, there's sort of two things happening. I think what the EU states and the other European states that are also in NATO have realized is the old days of artisanal style arms production, of maybe building one César French artillery system every 3 months or 4 months. That's no longer possible. The European states, as the United States will have to, as Russia's trying to, as China and India are doing, are going to have to recalibrate their supply chains, recalibrate their manufacturing and production facilities, recalibrate the structures that they have towards industrial forms of in military mass production. And in the process, of course, the French arms industry and the German Italian arms industry, the Italian arms industry, again, is substantial on the naval level. And the British arms industry matter. But the factories for that can produce for stuff for you fast and cheap, they're in Eastern Europe. And that also means that also reshapes the power balance within the European Union, as well as how these different states of the European Union relate to the UK. And that has very very interesting implications for what influence, for example, future Polish governments have in the European Commission, if defense becomes more of a European EU level thing, the role the Romanians have in determining EU foreign policy and security strategy. Suddenly they really matter. Brussels can't ignore what Bucharest is no longer just a state that is asked to nod and sign what the Commission wants, EU Commission wants. Romania now has leverage and can say, look, we're really important. We also need this stuff done for us within the EU system. So that has all kinds of very interesting implications, not just for the defense field, but also how the EU itself works.
So if we were to take a look at the defense shopping carts of the EU members and compare that to, let's say, what the US is buying at the moment, what do you think would be the major differences?
This is, again, a tension between, say, British or French ambitions and the rest of the EU. There is a consensus, if you go outside of Paris and London, that the Europeans, before they develop any global ambitions in the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean or the Pacific region, first we need to be able to do the basics, which is secure the Euro-Atlantic and Euro-Mediterranean areas, right? And that includes Ukraine. And also that opens up all kinds of interesting questions about, after this war, how does Ukraine become integrated in these structures too, especially when it becomes an EU member state? The great strategic advantage the United States has is it doesn't really have to worry about securing its own home waters. So the Americans can project power globally without really worrying about their home area. The Europeans operate in a fundamentally different geopolitical environment. They have Russia to the east. There's still the Maghreb, Tunisia, Morocco. Libya is a huge mess to the south. Egypt, if Egypt collapses, that's an absolute nightmare. It's a country of 100 million people, and its economy is about to fall over the cliff. Turkey has just gone through an earthquake, has a hostile government, but also somehow tied to the EU through NATO membership and customs. You have Ukraine managing Russia. Then you have the Sahel region to the south of North Africa, sort of Central and West Africa. These are endless numbers of security tasks. So I think the European horizon is really its neighborhood. How do we find a way of securing our neighborhood as Europeans without constantly having to ask for American help? And in a sense, that's also healthier for European relations to the United States. I mean, there's a lot of U.S. resentment at constantly having to come and dig the Europeans out of trouble and help them out. It would be a healthier relationship between Europe and the United States if the Europeans could take care of more of their own security needs. And of course, in partnership with the United States. I think that's the only way that works. American military spending and military horizons are truly global. Whereas even if the EU becomes which it already largely is, global economic power, in security terms, it can only really be a regional actor, but partly because the US has the advantage of having locked down complete security control of its region, whereas the EU is surrounded by all kinds of sources of crises that the Americans don't really have to handle or can handle at a distance.
Most of these defense shifts were kicked off by the invasion of Ukraine, but if the war in Ukraine quiets down or even solidifies into a sort of 2016 Donbass scenario, where the fighting is pretty minimal along the front, how does Europe's attitude toward defense change? Without a hot war happening in Ukraine, will Europe revert back to their 2021 defense plans? Or is this revitalized importance on defense something that's here to stay in Europe, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine?
This reorientation to heavy equipment, I think this is a generational shock, and all this spending is going to flow through. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have so battered the Russian military and so battered a substantial part of Vladimir Putin's repressive capacity that there's a distinct possibility that Russia over time enters into civil war or civil conflict, right? So I think even if Europe and Ukraine really win, like EU and NATO, UK and Ukraine really win, like Russia really loses badly, I still think the Europeans will be stuck with huge security problems related to Russia and the greater Eurasian area if Russia collapses. And so I think that spending is permanent, and I think that level of security commitment militarization is going to last, even if Russia is in serious trouble, because if Russia tips into being too weak, into too collapse, that's a whole separate security nightmare that will absorb European political, military, economic, social energy and factor in, say, Egypt's collapse if that happens. And so I think in that sense, that militarization is now permanent, and I think will bind European military and political and economic resources in its own European neighborhood and will make it very difficult for Europeans to play any significant role in the Indo-Pacific.
Geography can be a luxury. Whilst the UK and France are thousands of kilometers from the Russian borders, for Poland, Romania, the Baltics, and most notably Ukraine, the threat from Moscow is always front of mind. To these nations, Russia is a country that could be an annoying neighbour one day and racing tanks toward your capital in the next. So what are these countries doing to prepare for a possible Russian threat in the future? How quickly will they be able to do it? And is Eastern Europe shaping up to become the impregnable shield to defend the rest of the continent? Well, to answer that, we turn to a third guest. This was part 2 of a 4-part series on European rearmament. If you want to keep listening and examine how Eastern Europe, the Russians, and Poland are preparing for wider scale wars, as well as the war in Ukraine, simply click the link in the box that just popped up, or follow the links in the description.